This is Gene Roddenberry saying hello, Atlanta Convention, and hello, Atlanta Star Trek Society. Thank you, Owen Ogletree, Jr., for pushing me into doing this and seeing that I get it to you on time. I'm speaking to you from my home office out here on a high ridge in the Santa Monica Mountains, and from here I can overlook the blue Pacific. It's a sunny day, blue sky, and about 82 degrees, and I think the Los Angeles Olympic Committee is very, very happy it's turning out like this. First, the news on Star Trek. It does appear that we're going to have a Star Trek motion picture, number 4, and that Leonard Nimoy is going to be the director, which pleases me, and that Harve Bennett, which is going to be the producer, which also pleases me. And as in the last 2 Star Trek films, I will continue to be executive consultant. My recommendation on this one has been and will continue to be that we not take up a lot of time with a court-martial. I think there are 4 more exciting tales to do, although probably we will need enough continuity to explain where Kirk and the crew got the new starship that they'll be flying. As for what that vessel will be, my recommendation is that it be another USS Enterprise, essentially like the old one, but perhaps sleeker and designed to be more fun in some ways. And I'm very much against them taking over the USS Pregnant Duck that we saw in the last film. Answering the questions of those who wonder why I'm not writing or producing the film, in the first place, I'd like to make it clear, since there has been some question about this, I'd like to make it clear that it is not a case of mean, bad old Paramount shoving me aside, or certainly not a case of Harve Bennett or Leonard Nimoy or anyone else elbowing their way in. My contract, my basic contract on Star Trek, which goes back to the year 1965, gives me the absolute right to script and produce any and all Star Trek films. On the first Star Trek movie, I learned, and I should have known, that in Hollywood, of course, movies are made more by directors and by studios than by producers. Perhaps I could have changed that by fighting a couple of years, but I had already spent years fighting for Star Trek and had given up a great deal. I'll always regret the time Star Trek took me from my daughters when they were growing up, and I'm just not willing to do it again. So the job of executive consultant was a title I created to keep me near the show, keep me in some control of it, but allow others to go on and fight the fights and do the pictures. My contract says Star Trek must remain essentially Star Trek, and I'll see that it does that. Nor do I believe that Bennett, and certainly not Nimoy and Shatner and the rest, would let Star Trek be changed into the kind of science fiction where they land on a planet and begin zapping life there because it happens to look different or act differently. So I've now turned to some new projects, but meanwhile my position of executive consultant keeps me close to what's going on because I love Star Trek and I love the characters, and I will never let myself be completely separated from it. Turning now to some comments on general science fiction and on Imagineering and on the human future, I thought you might be interested in some comments I made to the L5 Society here in Los Angeles just a couple of weeks ago. I started off by telling them that I always feel a little concerned over taking the speaker's platform at events like that, and I said the same thing to the World Future Society in Washington, D.C. just a month before, which is that I sometimes feel a little trepidation in taking the speaker's platform because I fear that some might think I'm there because I consider Star Trek to have been an inspired vision of the human future. In his novel 1984, George Orwell suggests that every human has one great nightmarish fear, and I think mine is a terror that friends and associates might believe that I bed down at night in Space Admiral's pajamas. The fact I do go to such things commemorates some advice given to me 15 years ago by Arthur C. Clarke. It happened in summer 1969, 10 weeks after Star Trek had been canceled because of consistent low audience ratings. So having become unemployed, I was able to attend an Arizona University astronomy session where Clarke was the principal speaker. And as all of you know, I'm sure, Arthur Clarke is the author of science fiction classics ranging from Childhood's End to 2001, A Space Odyssey. And he's also, some don't know this, an equally brilliant scientist and futurist. At this Arizona session, it became clear that Clarke also knew a lot about the limitations placed on commercial television in this country, and really I could hardly believe my ears when I heard him congratulating me on what we had managed to accomplish during our show's 3-year run. And that was a rare moment for me, especially since my work had just been labeled by the television industry as an expensive and childish failure. I told Clarke that no advertising company had shown the slightest interest in purchasing even a first rerun of my Star Trek monstrosity. And I remember him smiling and pointing out that in the interval between that cancellation and this Arizona conference, Apollo had reached the moon, humans had actually walked on the surface of another world. And Clarke doubted that audiences would much longer consider space travel to be foolish fantasy. You might find this interesting. During our talk, Arthur and I were interrupted by a professor with an invitation to lecture in another state, expenses paid, a nice fee. When I realized the professor was talking not to Clarke but to me, I could not have been more shocked if he had been inviting me to come sleep with his wife. While I was attempting to politely decline that offer, a sort of Jekyll Hyde change was coming over Arthur C. Clarke. A moment ago he had been that nice English gentleman complimenting my work, and now he was angrily demanding to know why I was refusing to extend my horizons. Did I believe that my show business haunts of Hollywood and New York, and he can say those like dirty words, were somehow the center of the world? After agreeing to accept at least a dozen college and other speaking dates each year, I found myself wondering, what dozen invitations? And I was thinking Clarke may be a great futurist in some areas, but he's definitely a cuckoo in this one. The PS, of course, is that in less than a year, Star Trek reruns had become an entertainment business phenomenon, and a major lecture agent was handling me at Arthur's request. And I have been indebted to him ever since, because it was his advice that forced me into keeping myself an active part of the exciting ideas in this world. And the current example is talking to you folks, and the ones before were the L5 Society meeting and the World Future Society event. Arthur also advised me to stick to honesty when I was talking to people like you, or otherwise, in his words, one is likely to find one's skin being pegged to the wall. And I know some of you in Atlanta too well to risk breaking that rule now. I then talked to the L5 Society a bit about the title they had given me, which suggested that science fiction charts the future for science. And I told them that I didn't feel comfortable with that. Of course, the artist, in my case the dramatist, can ride imagination to a lot of places where science will one day go. But I've also ridden my imagination to places where any scientist would have to be crazy if he took one step in that direction. I guess the nicest thing that's ever happened to us on Star Trek regarding that is when the Smithsonian Institution in their National Air and Space Museum hung the 11-foot model of the USS Enterprise up in the same building where they have the Wright Brothers airplane and the Spirit of St. Louis and the first capsule and things like that. Really an exciting thing when they did that. And of course, the reason Smithsonian did that was to honor the fact that art goes to a lot of places before science does, and science and the engineers follow. And science fiction does predict many future happenings, of course, but it rarely does it in any accurate detail. Jules Verne, for example, carrying us down under the oceans, but if we tried to use his submarine design, we'd risk immediate drowning. And I think Star Trek is also an example of that. I never have for one moment believed that anything like the Starship Enterprise and Captain Kirk and his crew will ever be out there going from star to star 3 centuries from now. And the reason for that is right here in the 10,000 million miles of our own solar system, we've got 8 other planets and a dozen moons and much else to explore and to tame and to make into our home first before we go to the stars. We have a really wondrous backyard out here in our solar system, and it includes enough material and energy and challenges to keep humanity busy for 5 or 10 centuries. And the stars are almost unimaginably further away from that. Will we be going to the stars eventually? Yes, I'm confident that we will. But it will be much longer away, and we humans will undoubtedly be going there in ways far different than traveling a spaceship. Certainly we won't be traveling it in these very fragile bodies that we now have, which die in less than a century, and which really do not keep well, and which are destroyed if they ever get into a temperature that is below freezing and above water boiling. But on Star Trek, as for Kirk and the Starship crew, I had no choice but to design them as familiar 20th century types. And they were complete with 20th century morals and interests and value systems. The date might have been the 23rd century, but you understand, I'm sure, I had to play it to a 20th century audience. And particularly so in television, where you do not stay on the air unless you pull in well among over 20 million viewers each week. I think if I had given Kirk and the others what I suspect 23rd century values and morals may actually be, it would have either angered or scared the pants off the average viewer. You can easily prove that to yourself by imagining the reaction of anyone from 3 centuries in our past if they were brought into our times. And bringing someone from 3 centuries ago here means exposing them to bikinis and rock music and television, slam-bam car chases, and the very explicit language we use, and many, many other things. People arriving here from the year 1784 could only assume that they had died and gone to hell. And between now and 2284, our world will be changing many times faster than that. And I'm sure that some of you have heard me out on speaking engagements where I've explained that our knowledge is at this time doubling once every 7 years. And how in the year 1989, only 5 years from now, our scientific knowledge, and all of our knowledge for that matter, will have zoomed to 16 times what it was in 1961. And in 1996, human knowledge will skyrocket to 32 times what it was in 61. And with that skyrocketing knowledge will come skyrocketing changes in everything about us. And that's not bad. It's not anything to fear, because we've been changing like that for some time now. And we're going to keep changing like that, if for no other reason than the invention of the computer, which, ladies and gentlemen, the computer is not just another clever high-tech gadget. It is a primal invention, something on the order of the wheel, written language, and the printing press. Just as the invention of the machine, which was another primal invention before the computer, just as it gave us the industrial era and leisure time, which led to literacy, art, modern medicine, sanitation, mass education. In fact, everything that is good and comfortable in our lives came from the machine. The computer is a human happening on the next magnitude of wonder. Just as the machine magnified human muscle power, the computer amplifies human mind power. In other words, it amplifies the most powerful force in existence. Can we human handle changes of that magnitude? Is it possible to keep learning at that frantic pace? Isn't there a limit to what our brains can absorb? That's a lovely mystery, our magnificent forebrain. Because the grapefruit-sized cerebrum, which is something you could hold in your cupped hands, our cerebrum contains something like 20 billion signal-generating and transmitting neurons. And each of them is capable of up to 8 different types of connections with other neurons. And the mathematics of that is staggering. The mathematics of that adds up to our having a potential of over 200 trillion thought patterns. We humans are capable of that, a sum which happens to be greater than the number of stars in our galaxy. We're really something, we humans are. But we've got a long way to go and a lot to learn. For example, some members of the L5 Society asked me that evening, how can we possibly afford a space program when there's so much to be done here on this planet? And I pointed out that any people who can afford to spend $9 billion a year on cosmetics alone can certainly afford to do both, clean up this planet and have a space program. And certainly we can afford to do both because we spend even more billions than that on tobacco and booze and a dozen similar things. And if we wanted to save some real money, we would only have to go as far as the estimated 300 billions we waste, contributing it to organized crime each year through our desire to keep drug use a crime, which of course allows people to punish the poor devils who turn to drug use out of not being as intelligent or as psychologically balanced or as socially or physically favored as the rest of us. We treat them as we once treated the insane. And we're now ashamed of having done that to the insane. And I promise you that one day our treatment of people who turn to drug will shame us equally. As for people who have insisted, put the bastards in cages, I'd like to figure out a way to avoid taking that kind of nonsense with us up into the new world of space and of our solar system. In my opinion, science fiction can be a potent force in helping us clean up this planet and helping us move on out into space. It is not doing it at present in film because we're on sort of a cycle of science fiction being military. And for me personally, having been in the military, I think it's nonsense that most of our costumes in our science fiction shows today look like backstage at the student prince operetta. Science fiction is much too broad and exciting a field to be caught up forever in a cycle of slam bam, let's have space battles with the bad guys. I think that most science fiction films that are being made right now would be much better films if they took $1 million out of their optical effects and put it into story and into acting and casting and that sort of thing. I would like to see science fiction and imaginative writing live up to the exciting thing it can be. As Ray Bradbury once said, science fiction is one of the last places in our society that a philosopher can range as freely as he or she wants to do. And I think that's what science fiction should try to do. There's nothing wrong with it being fun, too. And that is what I'm trying to do in my new projects, as I tried to do in Star Trek. Do a little of both. All right, I'm going to close with that, and close with wishing all of you down in Atlanta, in old Georgia, which is my family's home state, happy convention, live long, all of you, and love long, too. That's even more important. Gene Roddenberry saying goodbye, and may we meet one way or another soon again.